So I appreciate Brad's prayer in reminding us that we all come to this conversation about trauma with our own stories. Maybe it's our own experience of trauma or the trauma of those we've worked with. So recognizing that as we have these conversations today, there may be moments where you feel yourself getting drawn towards something you remembered or activated a bit, or maybe even a little disconnected. And I just encourage you to notice that and then nurture yourself. That you can take a deep breath. If you actually feel like you need to leave the room, you're welcome to do that. But recognizing that this space is something that we want to create as a place for you to enter into the conversation and have the freedom to do that in the way that you need to do that. But with that said, we are going to take a trauma-informed approach to doing this presentation, and that we don't intend to share detailed stories or situations around trauma. And then I want to give you a frame of what we're going to do today. So please don't do that. Details, like traumatic details. You know what you're doing. So we are going to present this model or these reflections in a series of 3 presentations. So I will start by giving you a framing of concepts and talk through some of those big questions. What is trauma? What is trauma-informed? What is trauma-informed ministry? Then we'll move into Dave's presentation, and he'll take us deeper into the experience of ministry and the traumatic relationship to doing ministry with people who've been through trauma. So reflecting on the experience of secondary trauma or vicarious trauma. And then Lisseth will close us out with what we would consider real case studies. What does it look like to do trauma-informed ministry work in 2 different settings, one here in the States, in Los Angeles, and the other in Colombia. So we hope that that gives you a little bit of a taste of some of the big picture ideas, some unique experiences of those doing ministry work, and then this is how it looked in a certain setting. So that's what we're going to do today. So introducing the constructs. I'm going to first ask you, one of the things about being trauma-informed is thinking about where you are already. And so the SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Association in the US, has put together this idea of being trauma-informed, and 4 of the areas that they ask us to consider are these areas about the types, recognizing or realizing the types of trauma in our communities, recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma, that those have been impacted, being able to respond to trauma in a way that feels effective, and then being able to resist re-traumatization. So how do we respond in ways that don't continue to exacerbate the experience of trauma? So I just wanted you to take a moment and think about how confident you feel in each of those areas. And maybe make a note for yourself so that you can be thinking about areas that you want to be maybe listening more closely as we talk through these ideas together. So we're going to start with a bit of a reflection on that first question, the types of trauma. What is trauma? Just like the conversations yesterday around narcissism, there's ways that these terms get used in colloquial ways and professional or clinical ways, and there might be lots of different things that we mean by that. Like people will say, I was traumatized by that final exam. Probably was not the case, but it was really stressful. So the term that I like to use, and I have been using it for a while. I'm not sure where I got it, so I apologize if there's someone I should be referencing. But I use that phrase, that trauma as a threat to existence. And so think about the ways that might be actual physical existence, or might be psychic existence, or communal existence. So that first image of things like domestic violence, or interpersonal violence, or family violence. The threat to existence, there may be actual physical threat of harm happening in those contexts. But for children and neglect, there might be the experience of the threat of, am I going to survive? Are my parents going to be there for me? The threat of, am I okay? So that interpersonal trauma, child abuse, physical abuse, things like that is one type of threat to existence. And then the next image is an image of a natural disaster. It's actually from the earthquake in Turkey. And so communal or large-scale natural disaster kind of trauma is another trauma that we see and that is happening in our world all the time. And I want to note that all of us have been through a global trauma in terms of the pandemic. If you think about 4 years ago, at about this time, we were hearing conversations, hearing news coming out of different parts of the world around this thing called COVID. And so that was a threat to existence that impacted our entire globe. So in ministry, all of us, in some way or another, are navigating the consequences of that threat to existence. Then the third image, I'm not sure how much you can see, is an image from Black Lives Matter protests. And that is there in terms of acknowledging the threat to existence related to racial trauma. That an experience like the murder of George Floyd, leading to protests and claiming and acknowledging the ways that there's systemically a threat for individuals. And then you think about how that also then during COVID related to threats against the lives of Asian Americans and threats of physical integrity. So this communal, this racial, this dynamic of trauma that impacts us that might be not necessarily a specific event that you have personally experienced, but the way that impacts my sense of being part of my people and my group and that trauma reality. And then the final image, I had a really difficult time finding an image to represent spiritual trauma or spiritual abuse. So that's an image of a Bible and a dark cross. And recognizing that we actually can create contexts in our ministry settings where we are communicating a threat to existence using certain theological frames that are hellfire and brimstone, that are navigating and speaking judgment, maybe even that worm theology that we talked about yesterday in our sessions around narcissism, the way that that builds an internal sense of ongoing threat of existence if I'm not doing everything the way that I'm supposed to do. So you feel how broad and nuanced this could be. Like in your church, you could have people experiencing car accidents that are life-threatening. Or you could have people that are experiencing that sense of spiritual trauma because of maybe something they're reflecting on in terms of their own experience of sexuality. Or you might have someone who is in your congregation who is currently perpetrating domestic violence. Or they might be coming into your office and talking or not talking about those things. So this is where thinking about your particular context and the ways that some of those experiences might be showing themselves and might be kind of undercover, but mindful that they're happening. So another thing that I want to name is also the ways that our clinical diagnosis of trauma includes not just the experience of having an event happening to me personally, but also includes witnessing an event happening, or an event happening to someone I care about, or an event happening to someone that I'm serving in my job. So trauma has this way of spreading its impact. So that event, not just the event experience isn't just for the person who personally was part of it, but it impacts the community, impacts those who are helping them. And then I know this slide has a lot of information. We will make the slides available, so don't feel like you have to jot all this down. But instead of identifying the different PTSD diagnostic criteria, I wanted to just give us a taste and a reflection of the different ways that trauma impacts people's lives. It impacts it emotionally, through fear, through numbness, anger, irritability, guilt, shame, self-blame, denial, dissociation. It impacts us physically through gastrointestinal problems, headaches, sleep difficulties, nightmares, substance use and abuse, withdrawal from activities, hypervigilance or reactivity to reminders of the trauma, difficulty concentrating, being easily startled. Relational impacts like difficulty trusting or feeling dirty or broken in relationships, having conflict in relationships, becoming narcissistic in relationships, withdrawal, physical aggression, self-protection, hostility, and reactivity. And then the spiritual impacts that I believe we've seen in our clinical practices and our ministries, questioning where was God, feeling betrayed by our faith community, feeling betrayed by God, feeling like God might be punishing me for something I've done, feeling like God has abandoned me, isolating from the faith community or feeling shame. So you hear how that combination of all of those things, what it means to be holding those things, those experiences, can create a real deep sense of disconnection. Disconnection from my community, disconnection from myself, my experience, disconnection from God. And so when we think about what does it mean to navigate spaces and recognize, like back to the what is trauma, how many of us are experiencing some of those symptoms, some of that distress related to the things that we've experienced personally? What does that mean then to move towards being trauma informed? How do we take that information and think about the ways that it might impact our experiences in our ministries, in our clinical practices, in our schools? And SAMHSA introduces this idea of asking the question. So one of the main postures that I would love for you to take away from today, the key thing that I want you to leave with tattooed on your forehead is changing your question from what is wrong with you, and hear my tenor in that, what is wrong with you, to what happened to you. And that posture is increasing your empathy. It's increasing your opportunity to step back and say, I might be really, really pissed and confused by what you're doing right now, but I want to understand why, like what happened. And that is related then to SAMHSA's principles of being trauma-informed, principles of trauma-informed care. And I think I really want to highlight the ways that these are not just about understanding trauma or PTSD. In fact, you'll see that that's not even listed, right? Like knowing the diagnostic criteria of PTSD is not even part of being trauma-informed, but rather it's the posture that we take in the work that we do, recognizing how ubiquitous the experience of trauma is. How do we take that into mind and allow that to influence how we live out the work we do? And so these 6 areas: safety, I can't read up there, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, and cultural, historical, and gender factors in the work that we do. So we're going to unpack those bit by bit. So safety, thinking about how you ensure that the environment that you're working in is safe. That might be spiritually safe, that might be emotionally safe, that might be physically safe. And then how do you think about the ways that the relationships that are part of that work can contribute to that sense of safety? And you'll hear how these are all interlinked, right? They're not sort of discrete pieces of this puzzle, but they all work together because part of how you create safety is trustworthiness and transparency, right? That the work and decisions of the organization are done with transparency and that decisions are made in ways that seek to build trust. That you're talking about why you're making the decision, that there's an opportunity for people to understand, that it happens in a way that's open. And that helps to build trust for those that have a difficult time trusting. If they know, if they understand, that's an opportunity. And then peer support, the unique opportunity to recognize that the empowerment of people who've experienced things that are tough, the way they can support each other. So that peer relationships and that mutual support is key in the system of healing. It's not just me, the therapist, am going to provide the healing for you, the client. Or me, the pastor, am going to provide the spiritual nurture and care for you because of your experience of trauma. But that we recognize we as a community, we all need each other, and that there are unique ways that peers can support and speak into that work with each other. And again, hear this development then, the collaboration and mutuality, that peer support, that recognition of the ways that we're all involved, then allows us to build partnerships. So that reducing hierarchical systems and allowing an acknowledgement of the value of everyone's participation. So hear how this is an antidote to what we heard yesterday about narcissism, right? Thinking about our systems as a way to flatten whatever we can around that hierarchical nature and allowing that partnership to be the way the mutuality is developed, and how that then relates to empowerment, voice, and choice. One of the experiences of going through trauma is a sense of powerlessness. And so if I rush in as a helper and make all the choices for this person and say, this is how you're going to get better, we're continuing to reinforce that idea of powerlessness. So creating systems that actually have support that's undergirding and gives choice and listens to voice. And that acknowledging as well in that broad threat to existence that there are certain communities that have lost or been challenged with their voices, have been oppressed in their voices and marginalized, and making sure that that's even more acknowledged and empowered in the context of the work. And then finally, you can hear again how this relates to acknowledging those cultural, historical, and gender dynamics in the work that's happening. So thinking about how the historical trauma might be impacting the work that's going on, or how gender and sexuality might be embedded in some of the decisions that we make, how do we acknowledge those and bring those to light? So that's SAMHSA's idea about trauma-informed. What does it mean to do trauma-informed ministry? There's probably ways that you heard those 6 and went, how in the world would I do that? What does that exactly mean? And I will acknowledge we aren't going to give you all those answers today, but this is an encouragement for you to think about that there are examples of ministry, and here I have a couple here, Crosby et al. In their article looks at trauma-informed children's ministry and acknowledges that trauma-informed ministry values transparency, a preparation for doing the work, some of that acknowledgement and understanding, awareness and collaboration, and that all adults and children in the ministry feel safe, regulated, connected, and valued. So this idea of creating systems that allow the peacefulness, the regulation, this is a whole nother workshop that I love to do, but we talked about some of that in the conversations about the difficult conversations or having difficult conversations. But then also I wanted to highlight that spirituality that contributes to empowerment actually is a spirituality that leads to more well-being. And the study that I'm citing here showed that in a sample of individuals who had been through trauma, interpersonal trauma and child abuse, that spirituality wasn't actually significantly related to well-being. It was related to empowerment, which then related to well-being. So the way that approaching our spirituality in an empowered way gives us the opportunity to speak into people's lives in their recovery and well-being. And then with some of my own students, we had an opportunity to do a review, a survey of ministry workers and their ideas about how they do trauma response in their congregations. And in this predominantly white and male sample, we asked the questions, what types of trauma do you see in your congregations? And then how do you intervene with that community trauma? So what they saw is, like you can imagine, is a broad range. And again, this is prior to COVID. So this is examples of what they were seeing. And the first one, as you would imagine, is loss, traumatic loss. So grief as something that all pastors, most clergy and ministry workers are dealing with. But then not that far behind was domestic violence. The experiences of interpersonal dynamics and betrayals and violence. Then sexual assault, child sexual abuse, child physical abuse, community violence, immigration trauma, natural disasters, military combat, and others. So this whole range that's happening, keeping in mind what are the things that you're seeing. This is a sample of pastors and ministry workers were seeing in their own congregations. And then when we asked what kinds of work they were doing in intervening with members of their congregation, so many of them, so over a third, had some trauma-specific ministry types of experiences or trainings that they talked about. But then many of them, a good portion of them, were also referring those, which is really important and appropriate, back to what Brad said about the work that you do as a pastoral counselor, that 3 sessions and refer. So having a good referral note, and then using the pastoral role, the ministry of presence, navigating and engaging the community to provide practical support for the survivor. Those really great pastoral things. We want to reinforce the ways that pastors, clergy members, ministry workers have unique opportunities to serve their congregations as trauma survivors or creating that space that's trauma-informed. But then things that we didn't see as much of that we want to acknowledge is that there wasn't as much talk about knowing about trauma or understanding what some of those trauma responses might be. Very few talked about the issues of safety. Very few acknowledged safety as something that they'd be thinking about. And then similarly, fewer talking about collaborative responses or empowerment that wasn't just about giving a referral, and then very, very few acknowledging the cultural issues or the historical factors related to the trauma that was happening in their congregations. So we have work to do. I want to reinforce the unique role that ministry workers have in doing trauma-informed, using their strengths around spiritual support and pastoral care, but the work that we can do to keep building and understanding what trauma-informed ministry might look like. So I'm leaving you with that question: what principles already exist in your ministry, and that what principles are missing, and how might you grow in those?
Thank you, Cynthia, and I look forward to continuing where you left off by talking a little bit about trauma-informed ministry as it applies not just to congregations, but to the pastors and the Christian leaders themselves. So I am so grateful to be on faculty here at Fuller. I'm a clinical psychologist where I do a lot of my clinical work with pastors and missionaries and Christian leaders. And that ends up, even though we don't explicitly acknowledge this in the very beginning, we end up doing a lot of trauma work with Christian leaders. And we're talking about a lot of the categories that Cynthia just mentioned, such as spiritual trauma, as well as relational trauma and other forms of trauma. And one of my favorite colleagues and a good friend of mine, Keith Edwards, some of you may know him, he used to explain to me, he used to go, David, you know who keeps us Christian psychologists in business? It's the church. And I find that both amusing and depressing, both at the same time. And what I'd like to start off my portion of today's presentation with is a story that I'd love for us to just spend a moment or two discussing, if you're comfortable doing, with a person next to you. And I'll just read this story initially. It's a story on spiritual trauma, but without details. And it goes as follows. I heard about a missionary kid in a missionary boarding school who was sexually abused by a staff member who also happened to be a missionary. And her parents informed the school and mission agency, but were met with indifference and inaction. This is the opposite of trauma-informed care, by the way. The school and agency felt like it might cause problems for them if they exposed the staff member, so they encouraged the family to work through this incident privately. This event naturally and very understandably caused this missionary kid, who's now an adult, to wonder if God cared about her situation, and went a long time believing that her problems, aka her trauma, were not important to God nor the church. This type of spiritual trauma leads many missionary kids and adult missionaries as well to leave the church once they are grown up. So with a person next to you, I'd love for you to begin discussions about, does a story like this surprise you? And if it doesn't, why are many churches and Christian organizations reluctant to address these kinds of situations and instead tend to ignore or cover up or minimize these situations? I just shared this story with a global working group. We're working on mobilizing evangelical seminaries and institutions to offer a more robust and integrous response to clergy sexual misconduct. And I framed this as a North American story, and I asked if you see this in other parts of the world, and the answer was a resounding yes. So with the person next to you, why does it seem like this happens so often all around the world? Discuss for a minute or two. Well, it sounds like we have a lot to say about this, huh? I would have loved to be able to interact with you directly in this moment, but we do have a Q&A time towards the end of this session, and we also have another panel time for interaction and group discussion at 3 o'clock this afternoon. I'm very interested to hear what you talked about at that point. And as I reflect on this question myself, I recall a conversation with Diane Langberg, who has done research and work in intervention in this area, probably one of the first Christian psychologists to acknowledge and do work here. And she would say that Christians need to begin to prioritize people over institutions. And I think if we want to capture this notion of trauma-informed ministry in a nutshell, and I think Cynthia established this very beautifully, it's really about prioritizing people, the people of God, over the institutions or the ministries of God. What is another reason why trauma-informed ministry is important? In fact, the speaker for next year's Integration Symposium, Shelley Rambo, she says the following: trauma is what does not go away. It persists. There's something about trauma that just persists in symptoms that live on in the body, in the intrusive fragments of memories that return. It persists in symptoms that live on in communities. And there's so much to unpack here. I think there's this common Christian notion in Christian communities that if you just give a child a loving home, that everything's going to disappear, no matter what they experienced beforehand. And that's not even true of Jesus Christ, who died on the cross. That was a trauma, and presented to doubting Thomas with his scars still on his hand and on his side. Right? It persists in symptoms that live on in the body. So when we talk about the impact of trauma, it's not just on an emotional or psychological dimension, but it's very much in a physiological. It's embodied, as some people describe, in every single cell of our body. And last, it persists in symptoms that live on in communities. So there is such a thing as communal trauma. I believe every culture in the world has its own unique trauma footprint, right? My grandfather was a general for Chiang Kai-shek. And during the Cultural Revolution in World War II, we fled to Taiwan. And from Taiwan, my parents immigrated here to America. And even though I was born 60 to 70 years later on the other side of the world, I still feel the effects of the trauma that shaped my family over the last several generations. And when I teach on this topic in Asia, even though it may not be spoken of openly, and even though in certain parts of Asia that might be very wealthy, we haven't forgotten what happened just 60 years ago. So trauma, and this is a topic to be uncovered and unpacked perhaps at a different time, trauma gets passed down intergenerationally. So revisiting the formal definition of a traumatic situation or trauma event, this is the formal definition offered by the DSM. This is the criteria used to diagnose disorders such as post-traumatic stress disorder. So according to the DSM-5, a traumatic event is characterized by the following: when a person has experienced, witnessed, or been confronted with an event or events that involve actual or threatened death or serious injury, or a threat to the physical integrity of oneself or others. This is an imperfect definition. Don't have time to unpack why this is an imperfect definition. But what I want to do instead is to highlight the first few words and to highlight the fact that you can be exposed to trauma not just through direct experience, but also through witnessing somebody else's trauma or being confronted indirectly by the trauma of other people. So we're not talking about our own traumatic experiences that we've experienced in our own life journey. We're also talking about us being exposed and confronting the trauma of others. Which brings us to the topic of trauma and pastors and Christian leaders. Because when you think of who is the first person who is called when something goes down in a church community or when something goes down in a neighborhood, it's usually the pastor or the pastor's spouse, right? Who's doing the funerals, right? Who's doing the grief counseling? So when you think about work-related hazards, we have to think about indirect exposure to trauma when we think about the work of a clergy member or any kind of Christian leader. So I know this is a rhetorical question, but I want to land this point in a strong and a firm way. Now, if trauma can be defined as witnessing someone else go through trauma, or even accompanying someone else in their trauma, and if our day-to-day ministry and work responsibilities as helping professionals or as Christian leaders brings us into both direct and indirect contact with the population with a high prevalence of trauma, is it possible for us as leaders to develop PTSD symptoms of our own? And the answer is yes. And what we call that is secondary traumatic stress. Some scholars might describe it as vicarious trauma as well. And what we're referring to is when people who are exposed to other people's traumatic stories develop their own traumatic symptoms and reactions. And this is relevant not just to pastors, but also to mental health professionals and psychologists as well. So let me talk a little bit more about secondary traumatic stress. We're talking, as I mentioned earlier, about symptoms that are similar to PTSD. They're virtually identical to PTSD. Every single symptom cluster of PTSD is potentially part of secondary trauma. So we're talking about intrusive thoughts, re-experiencing symptoms, hyperarousal, avoidance, negative effects on one's cognition and mood. This could be triggered by a one-time event, so you don't need to be doing therapy or in ministry very long for you to potentially be impacted by something like secondary trauma. And there's oftentimes a high comorbidity with other mental health conditions such as depression, anxiety disorders, as well as addictions. And the research suggests that there's a certain type of person that is particularly vulnerable to things like secondary traumatic stress, and it's those people who have empathy. So if you happen to be or know someone who is a pastor or a counselor because you just love people, you're uniquely vulnerable for this kind of thing. Do you know who's not uniquely vulnerable for this kind of thing? You read my mind. We talked about that yesterday. And this kind of thing is quite prevalent in any helping profession, from humanitarian aid workers, social workers, child protective services, clinicians treating sexual offenders and sexual abuse survivors. There is something about working with sexual trauma, and in particular, sexual trauma involving children, that is uniquely disruptive, right, to ourselves, our soul, and our spirituality as well. What are personal risk factors for secondary trauma? If you have a history of your own trauma, if you might personally identify with the survivor or the survivor's experience and stories, if you're undergoing some sort of negative personal circumstances in your own life, if you have low levels of social support, lack of meaningful relationships, if you have a low sense of control in your life, personal coping strategies that don't seem to help. And I think there's this latent idea behind all of these points, which is, I think if you're in graduate school, you probably embody a lot of these personal risk factors all at the same time. Some researchers and scholars have also begun to examine what are the spiritual implications of secondary trauma. And Dombo and Gray suggest that, in fact, the hallmark of vicarious traumatization is actually disrupted spirituality. But I think this is something that more work needs to be done. So we were interested in doing some empirical research on the prevalence and the impact of secondary trauma on Christian leaders and clergy. So we collected some data as part of a 5-year initiative funded by the Lilly Endowment, working with a network of predominantly African-American churches throughout the state of Texas. And we collected data from 99 participants in our initial cohort of 25 churches, and this is what we found. Comparable to the general population, Christian leaders reported, about 80% of them reported at least one adverse childhood experience, so one form of childhood trauma, and with the most common being divorce or separation of parents. Household member was a problematic drinker or used drugs. A household member was depressed, mentally ill, or attempted suicide. And on the right side, you'll see some percentages, and I think some of the words didn't export into this slide. But this is, so when it says STS, 52%, what we found is 52% of our clergy sample reported moderate to severe levels of secondary traumatic stress. 52%, and not just slight, moderate to severe. 50% also reported moderate to severe anxiety, 30% moderate to severe PTSD symptoms, and then 14% moderate to severe depression. I'm still the editor of the Journal of Psychology and Theology, at least for another few months. And we just published an article by some friends over at the Duke Global Health Initiative. And they looked at a different sample of clergy, a very large sample of clergy in the United Methodist denomination on the East Coast. And what they did is they looked at their prevalence rates of different childhood traumas, adverse childhood experiences, and compared it to a nationally matched sample. And they found that on average, pastors have more trauma than the general population. But it wasn't every single kind of trauma. It was actually relational trauma, specifically in the form of emotional abuse as a child, living with someone with a mental illness, and sexual abuse. So this is hot off the press. We just published this in the journal a month ago. And that's gotten us thinking about, is it possible that relational trauma actually shapes people's call into the ministry? We have 1 minute. I want to invite you to discuss this a little bit more with the person next to you. And also, what are your reactions to all of this that we just talked about? Go ahead. We can talk about this all day. And I would encourage us to go into this together during Q&A and during our panel discussion at 3 p.m. But let me just land with this one more point that I mentioned earlier. When we think of trauma-informed ministry, oftentimes the first direction, the first place our minds go to is the congregation, the needs of the community, and that's fair. And perhaps the point I want to make today is that we don't want to forget that actually the pastors and the leaders themselves, we need trauma-informed ministry just as much as everyone else does as well. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction. So we have heard, and we now know, that trauma is a public health issue that affects individuals, families, communities, and nations. I want to continue this conversation on trauma-informed care by focusing on the fantastic work of faithful Christian leaders in Colombia and Latino pastors in the United States. These brave clergy, pastors, pastoras, minister among groups of that have shared historical experiences related to dispossession of resources, land, traumatization, separation from family and community, immigration and displacement. Based on my preventive research in these two contexts, I want to distill 3 lessons that I have learned that perhaps could enhance our work with these populations. Whether you are providing services as ministers or as mental health providers. Lesson number 1. We must develop and nurture a trauma-informed faith. Lesson number 2. We must have a sociopolitical and historical trauma lens whenever we're working with marginalized populations. That's number 3. You get that, Ana Professor. We must engage in a holistic trauma-informed care approach that focuses not only on deficits, but on strengths, not just on individuals, but entire families and communities. I was pulled into this trauma business even before I became a psychologist. For starters, I was born and raised in Colombia, a country with a long history of armed conflict. But a particularly salient moment in my life that got etched in my heart was when I was doing missionary work with Operation Mobilization, back in the days when I was a spring chicken. As the lineup person for the ship logos, I was assigned to prepare the visit to El Salvador in 1986. Now, for those of you who know a bit of Central American history, you probably have figured out, but at that time, El Salvador was undergoing a civil war, a long, bloody 12-year civil war. Before heading there, my supervisors grilled my Swedish partners and I on how to prepare ourselves to face challenging situations due to the war. But they failed to prepare me on how to face the aftermath of a giant earthquake that took place a week before our arrival to San Salvador. I remember being emotionally overwhelmed by the massive destruction and devastation from this earthquake, which at that time was classified as one of the worst, deadliest earthquakes that left over 1,000 people dead, 10,000 injured, 200,000 homeless, and severe landslides in San Salvador. The suffering and displacement created by this unexpected natural disaster were compounded and exponentially made worse by human violence. I wanted to help, but I didn't know how. I felt helpless amidst so much suffering. I started questioning God and His mercy and wondering what the hell I was doing there, bringing good news to these people that were suffering. The ship's evangelistic agenda felt very hollow and useless in the face of so much suffering and emotional needs. In retrospect, I wish I had attended this symposium before. In hindsight, I definitely needed trauma-informed care. I needed a faith that was fully informed by trauma that could help me deal and face the horrors of pain and trauma and give me hope to accompany and effectively support those affected by traumatic experiences. But now my encounter with tragedy, violence, and loss is not unique. If you're in the business of the church, if you're in the business of helping others, I bet you have encountered overwhelming pain and suffering yourself that may have paralyzed you and render your helplessness for some time, and perhaps even left you questioning God and His love in the midst of so much suffering. So since I'm no longer a spring chicken, and I have managed to get a PhD in clinical psychology, and I have some tools under my sleeve, I'm going to walk you through some lessons, and I'll start focusing on Colombia. And then I'll move back to the Latino community. And I hope that you can distill lesson 2 and 3 and just tell you these stories. There's a pressing need to have a sociopolitical and historical trauma-informed care lens and to engage in a holistic trauma-informed approach. For context, Colombia has experienced a 50-year-long armed conflict. In 2016, peace accords were signed by the Colombian government and the Revolutionary Armed Forces, FARC. However, violence has continued. Even though it has decreased overall, it has continued at local levels due to armed factions, drug trafficking, violence against activists, community leaders, and former comebacks. So one can easily claim that an entire generation has been touched by trauma in one way or another: direct, indirect, vicarious trauma. And we know that Trauma resulting from interpersonal violence is particularly detrimental to mental health and spiritual well-being. And we also must be reminded that although trauma resulting from interpersonal violence is widely recognized, it's also deeply rooted in social and political processes affecting communities. I'll spare you the history of a history lesson today, but I want you to know that the armed conflict left over 7 million people in situations of displacement. Internally displaced peoples, or IDPs, are people who have been forced to migrate within the country and have not crossed international boundaries. When people are disposed of their land and resources, internal and external migration becomes necessary for survival. Persons in situations of displacement generally have limited access to humanitarian aid and are considered among the most vulnerable in the world. So it is in this context that the Christian churches are ministering. It is in this context that one needs a trauma-informed faith that allows for mourning and gives room for lament instead of hollow consolation. As my colleague Tommy Gibbons says, we need a spirituality of solidarity and presence amid sometimes unhealed pain and loss in such contexts. I immigrated to the United States when I was 16 on speed dial to 2014, and we were invited to go to Medellin to present at a theological conference on faith and displacement in Colombia. At this conference, a bunch of theologians and me, not a theologian, underscore, were challenged by the audience to respond in practical ways to the multidimensional needs of the people affected by internal conflict. Evangelical pastors and Catholic leaders were asking us to provide multidisciplinary, integrative tools that they could use and that were congruent with psychology and theology. So, in order to do this, we took on the challenge with a generous foundation of the Foundation from Templeton Word Charity Foundation and the Seminary in Colombia. We took on a project that lasted about 7 years. And involved many different disciplines, several different disciplines, from psychology to education to economy, and involved local professionals in those disciplines, as well as faith leaders and theologians. The theologians were assigned to help the professionals translate and integrate faith and with practical resources specifically designed to support the clergy. So I'll spare you all those details, but it was clear from the findings, from focus groups and surveys that we ran through the years in several communities in Colombia, that the message was loud and clear. They needed more training. They wanted us to develop educational resources to support and strengthen the faith leaders' response to the needs of the IDPs. I must give a big shout out to Dr. Josie Wang. Yes, she's a school psychology alum, and at that time she was residing in Peru and working at the university in Peru, in one of the universities in Peru. But she was helping us conduct a lot of these focus groups and was a co-author in many of the resources that we develop, and also other doctoral students that accompany me here. The message was clear. The faith leaders recognized and pointed out to many barriers and obstacles that they face. In particular, the lack of knowledge about the impact of trauma and displacements, which we knew could be addressed with training and education. They expressed that the needs were highly interrelated and highlighted the need for us to focus on the IDP's integral health and dignity. The persons in situation of displacement themselves did not view their physical needs as separate or independent from social, vocational, and psychological needs. The faith leaders express a need for a holistic understanding of the IDPs and their communities and how much they feel unprepared to address some of those needs. So with the input from all these folks and the assistance of Dr. Tommy Givens as our theologians, we developed 3 key resources for the church. The first one, due to a lack of practitioners in many of the rural areas, we developed a self-administered workbook for faith leaders that walk them through 7 lessons and unpack trauma. We also developed a resource for mental health professionals within the church that was integrated and helped them be able to talk and engage the church using integrating faith in their work. And we developed a curriculum for IDPs led by faith leaders, trained faith leaders. They were all created in Spanish. I was very proud of that work. And we continue to look and examine, hear, and get input from the community. And not surprisingly, the faith leaders indicated that completing the workbook by themselves was not so hot. They actually said, you know what, we do this in groups. You tell us to do it alone? No, we do it in groups. Because it facilitated the understanding of the content, particularly if they have low schooling. And it also, the collective study helped them share diverse experiences with the material and enrich their collective critical and contextual analysis of what we were trying to convey. I think a crucial lesson that we learned, that I want to emphasize here today, is that the working with the church in creating trauma-informed resources requires patience and humble, multiple iterations. The feedback loop must be rigorous but flexible and attentive to cultural and sociopolitical context and at minimum, a cursory understanding of the prevalence of sociopolitical events and political violence in Latin America in this case, and in general, and specifically in Colombia. We must consider the historical and current sociopolitical contexts that create violence, displacement, and economic marginalization. When working in contexts plagued by violence like this and armed conflict, our trauma work must attend not only to the spiritual and emotional needs, but it must also raise a social political awareness amongst those that are ministering those affected by trauma. That are ministering and those that are affected by trauma. And training should embed competence in fostering equitable partnerships with community leaders and also attend to their own experiences of secondary trauma. Let me just say that our work needs to be informed by a framework that is grounded in integral missiology. Integral missiology states that the salvation that the gospel proclaims is not limited to man's reconciliation to God. It involves the remaking of man in all the dimensions of his and her existence. All of the dimensions of his and her existence. And it has to do with the recovery of the whole man according to God's original purpose for his creation. All right, I only have 4 minutes for the United States. How about that? So let me take you there. So with the lessons that we learn in Colombia, I realized that we have, and the resources that we develop in Spanish, I realized that I was sitting on a treasure. Because you see, here in the United States with the Latino immigrant community, we don't have many Spanish-speaking resources. We're still struggling with that. So along with a colleague, another former student from SOP, Dr. Jennifer Wang, and who's currently a professor at Pepperdine right now, we, in the support of the Luz Foundation, we set out to adapt that self-administered workbook to this context. We were informed by our experiences with immigration and our research on immigration enforcement and the impact on families, our understanding that we needed to have a trauma-informed lens that was also informed by social determinants of health, by health disparities, by migration and trauma histories. From our work with immigration, we understand the challenging context that the Latino pastors were serving, a landscape marked by health disparities, by family separation, poverty, racism, discrimination. This graph here is a little pack, but let me just say it illustrates a scenario of a Guatemalan family so that can help us understand the health and the mental health of Latino populations in the United States, and how we need to be aware of the historical trauma, both the shared and the diverse experiences of families, the intergenerational transmission of trauma and resilience. So not just trauma, but also resilience. Remember the strengths. And the current sociopolitical threat and deprivation in the U.S. associated with immigration enforcement, marginalized identities when working with families like this Guatemalan family that had experienced genocide in Guatemala as an indigenous community. So I want to make sure that we are attentive to all the structural scene that creates situations of trauma, potential situations of trauma. We have adapted with this study. We tested out, and again, following some of the same model in Colombia, we worked with 33 Latino pastors and pastoras and faith leaders, and we surveyed, and then prior to trying out the workbook with them, to understand what were they thinking, what were they needing, what was going on. One of the key things that came out is that they themselves were wounded healers, right? They have experienced their share amount of direct, indirect, and vicarious trauma. They have been working laboriously to support these families, but they have their own baggage and they needed support. So we adapted and they told us that they also they didn't know much about trauma-informed care. They didn't know, even though we were conducting this project in the middle of the pandemic, much about the impact of the pandemic, although they can see the impact of the pandemic on their communities. We asked them, have you experienced, how has the immigration enforcement impacted your communities? See, many immigrant Latino churches are serving the undocumented, the families with precarious legal status, families with mixed status. And they told us at first, about one-third of our churches are being impacted by this. And of those, the majority are families with children. Interestingly enough, that was said at the beginning. At the end of all our work together of 10 weeks, that figure tripled. Same with the awareness of the impact of the pandemic, even though it was definitely very, very much so happening at that time. We have a plethora of data documenting how the COVID pandemic has disproportionately deepened social inequalities among low-income Latino families. And I want you to, I don't know what your opinions are about the pandemic, but let me tell you something. It has impacted the Latino community and the Black community in amazing, tremendous ways. So I'm gonna let this Latino pastor tell you his story about this. He said, I experienced the pandemic as a pastor in Los Angeles, in the city, in South Central Los Angeles, where all the churches in 2020, all the churches were closed. The food banks closed, and we had a food bank. So we were the only church with a food bank that was distributing food to a bunch of people who were sick with COVID. I had to bury several pastor friends of mine, various people. That was every week. When my phone would ring, my question was, who? Who has died? I was at the cemetery. Every 15 minutes, I had to bury someone. The lines at the cemeteries were extremely full, and they would only give us 15 minutes to bury someone and then move on to the next ones. That caused me significant trauma. So much that the next year, 2 years afterwards, I had to take a sabbatical and ultimately moved out of here. He actually moved out of state, where I am now. It took a while for some of these pastors to open up because the automatic mode was to embrace, lean on a triumphalist spirituality. We can do this. We can survive this. God is all good. Just have faith. And to this day, many churches in Latin America and here in the States still find this triumphalist spirituality. But with this trauma-formed faith, we were saying, no, sit with the pain, learn to lament, stay with it. So we added, not super Jesus, we added a grief and trauma loss lesson plan. We added 2 other lessons that were unpacking this whole issue of inequality, social sin, social structural sin, social determinants of health, so that we can really empower the pastors to also be thinking holistically about how to address these issues. Immigration, enforcement, the pandemic, and other structural issues that they were facing. I'll spare you here. I'm going to end because I think that thing is blinking over there telling me I need to stop. So I'm going to pay attention to the blinking light. We did receive excellent feedback. We have learned a lot working with Latino pastors here in the United States as well. We know the importance and the emphasis that they said that we must frame the trauma and suffering within biblical worldview to help them reconcile their experienced horrors, injustice, and continued oppression. Reconcile that with the narrative of love and salvation and forgiveness that God provides. There's so many lessons and so little time right now. But I want to leave you with this inspired image of a fellow Colombian. An image that for me captures a deep resilience, plenty of post-traumatic growth, and a stubborn resistance to evil. This is the picture of Ana Felicia Velázquez, dignifying her abandoned home on the anniversary of her forced displacement. In my work in Colombia and with Latinos working with immigrant families in the US, faith leaders are in the business of dignifying marginalized populations affected by historical and sociopolitical trauma, often with little tools and minimal support from others and their congregations. So let's prayerfully and thoughtfully accompany them with trauma and faith-informed tools and trainings that can make the work more effectively. Amen.
I want to start with this question right away. Can immigrant children crossing the border create trauma? As a pastor, how can I help this type of trauma in our congregations when we tend to focus more on adults? Where do we refer kids?
Hello? Yes. Good question. Yes, the whole process of migration is full of potential events that can be potentially traumatic. So I encourage pastors, encourage the church to understand the process of migration and what, not just from when they get here, but how did it come about? Why did they have to leave their country and the journey, what happened in the journey to the United States and entering the United States? Now, what I would say too, in terms of getting support, there are definitely many groups. I'm not sure where you are located, but here in Southern California, there are plenty of immigrant advocacy groups that have fantastic supports and connections with mental health providers that can assist on this matter. But I want to encourage you to also be thinking holistically, how to support parents. Parents are the best shield against adversity to protect the kids. So not just think giving services to the kids, think about giving services to the entire family, particularly the caregiver. If you empower them, if you give them the tools, the support, they can really help facilitate the healing that these kids need to go through in order to address potential trauma.
That's great. That's wonderful. Another question is a question about gender differences in trauma, symptomatology differences. Can any of you speak to that? Is there any research on that?
Well, I think that's why the range of symptoms that were listed is there's going to be different experiences. I know that epidemiological research shows that men might be describe more exposure to different types of traumas, but women will report more symptomatology and more distress related to trauma experiences. And I think one of the things that I think it was Dave noted that you were noting in terms of context of secondary trauma, but different types of trauma also have levels of distress related to them or different, we call it more traumagenic. So, things like sexual assault, that is a more traumagenic, more likely to cause distress than something like the experience of a natural disaster. But then there's also the severity of the threat, the severity of the loss related to each of those things. So I think gender as part of that in terms of maybe even the experience of marginalization or other dynamics that might relate to the experience of being a male or female or non-binary in that context. But yeah, it's the nuances and complexity. Yeah.
And to add, I mentioned that there's limitations to the definition of what a traumatic event is, and one of the limitations is that it's very gender normative. So PTSD was a diagnosis that came out during the Vietnam War era. And because of that, our understanding of trauma and the impact of trauma is normed after a combat veteran, male, young adult, people shooting at you, that kind of trauma. And the field is recognizing more and more that although that is absolutely a valid form of trauma, it doesn't represent all the different kinds of traumas that people experience. So especially the kinds of traumas that are relational in nature, where you actually have the person, the perpetrator. In fact, the perpetrator is supposed to be someone that you can trust and someone that's supposed to protect you. When traumas are not just kind of a one-time firefight event, but perhaps in person's entire childhood. So when traumas get more relational, when they get more complex, we call this complex trauma, then the traditional PTSD diagnosis doesn't necessarily capture everything as well. And that's why several of us here have talked about the symptom of dissociation and how common of a symptom, and dissociation is somewhat contained in PTSD, but it's not really well contained in our current diagnosis. But you see dissociation a lot more commonly in relational trauma, because when you think of childhood trauma, for example, I think God created us to have this instinct to relocate ourselves away from a threat. But if the threat happens at home with people that we rely on, we can't physically relocate because there's nowhere to run. So the human mind often learns that the next best option is for me to mentally check out. And that's my way of relocating myself away from the threat because I can't do so physically. And that's why a lot of trauma survivors have symptoms of dissociation because that's the way we survived earlier in life.
That's great. So in the minute and a half we have left, this question is about a ministerial context. After a church has become aware that they have not responded well to people who have been traumatized or maybe even involved in trauma, what would be some practical markers that describe an ideal approach to sharing apologies and doing repair work with those who have been hurt?
And that's an excellent question. And I think that, what first comes to mind is what Lisseth was talking about in terms of also having a trauma-informed faith. So I think one first step would be, how am I even thinking about my motivation for doing the repair? And what am I going to do in terms of allow what I'm experiencing or what I'm seeing happen that have caused harm to influence how we might change things overall too. So I would want to go towards the conversation, the apology, the recognition of the harm, some of the things that we've talked about in terms of having difficult conversations, and then also be thinking about how am I going to actually allow this person's voice or the community's voice to influence how we do things differently. So even approaching that apology or that acknowledgement in a mutual and collaborative and an empowering way. So that's one of my first thoughts.
Let me just add to that, that I think that we should also create systems of care within the church. So once you understand that you need to be responding, the pastor needs to kind of come together with our team and figure out, okay, who is going to be sort of the person where the member of the church can come to talk about it, and sort of determine a way of screening within the church, who can do spiritual counseling, who can, when to refer out if they cannot handle the situation. Definitely outlining and mapping out what are the rutas of I'm thinking in Spanish, the processes of care, right? Like a diagram, who is going to do what. You really have to spell it out. You cannot just talk the talk. You have to have the processing line up so that everybody knows how to mobilize and before an emergency, before an event happens.